Oh, hi, Pop Kids! As you know, we're learning today that when you forgive others, it can change them. Today, we'll get to meet one person whose life was changed by Jesus in a big way. At this point, Jesus was already getting very popular. Word had spread about his miracles and his teachings and his way of treating people. Everywhere Jesus went, huge crowds of people came to see him. Religious leaders, everyday people, Roman soldiers, men, women, children, and people who were considered outcasts. Now one day, Jesus entered a town called Jericho. A man named Zacchaeus lived there. Maybe you've heard his name before. Zacchaeus had a job that made him very unpopular with the people. He was a chief tax collector. Now, in Jesus' time, people did not like tax collectors like Zacchaeus for two main reasons. Number one, these tax collectors worked for the Romans, who were ruling over the Jewish people at that time. It felt like the tax collectors were siding with the Romans against their own people. And number two, the Romans didn't pay the tax collectors, but the tax collectors still needed to eat. That forced the tax collectors to take a little extra money from the people, just so that they could eat. But while they were at it, some tax collectors took even more money for themselves, so they could get rich. For example, let's say the amount of money to be collected was $100. Now, a tax collector like Zacchaeus might tell people that they owed $200 and then keep that extra $100 for himself, even if that $100 was actually way more than he really needed to live. Now, Zacchaeus had definitely been stealing money from people this way. But then he heard that Jesus was coming to town, and he wanted to see who Jesus was. Maybe he'd heard about Jesus, and he wanted to join the crowds just to catch a glimpse of him. One problem, though, Zacchaeus was not a very tall dude. In fact, he was pretty short. So short, he couldn't see over the crowd. Even if he jumped, he wasn't going to be able to see Jesus. And because nobody liked Zacchaeus, they were not going to make space for him at the front. No way. What Zacchaeus did next was actually pretty interesting. He could have just said, forget it. The crowds are too big. I'll just hear about Jesus from everybody else after he leaves town. Zacchaeus could have gone home and given up, but he didn't. Zacchaeus ran ahead of the crowds and he climbed up a sycamore fig tree. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen a sycamore fig tree before, but they can grow to be really big, up to 30 feet tall. Whoa. They have large trunks and wide, thick branches, a great place to sit and hide up high to watch the parade. There! Now Zacchaeus could see over the crowd. Now see if you can imagine this. Jesus was walking in a huge crowd of people and everyone was talking, yelling, maybe even singing because they were celebrating. If you've ever seen a big crowd of people, you know it can get pretty noisy. But then, over all that noise, Jesus shouted Zacchaeus' name. Zacchaeus! The crowd probably went silent. They all probably turned around and stared at Zacchaeus. Remember, this was the guy who had taken their money, maybe even stolen it to make himself rich. But Jesus looked up and Jesus said, Zacchaeus, come down at once. I must stay at your house today. Okay, pause for a moment. I've heard this story lots of times, and there's one thing that gets me every time I read it. How did Jesus know Zacchaeus' name? Jesus had never met Zacchaeus before, as far as we know. Zacchaeus isn't mentioned in the Bible in any other stories, but Jesus already knew him. Jesus called out his name, and Jesus asked if he could come over to Zacchaeus' house. The people were so confused. What was Jesus doing hanging out with a guy like Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus is mean. He's not honest. Why would Jesus want to hang out with him? Well, Zacchaeus came down from the tree and he welcomed Jesus into his house, and Jesus went. The people were stunned. They couldn't understand why Jesus would invite himself, to this tax collector's house? Everything in Zacchaeus' house was probably bought with the money that he stole from people. The decorations, the furniture, even the food. That was probably all bought with stolen money. But along the way, maybe even in the moment when Jesus called out his name, something in Zacchaeus changed. While Jesus was there at his house, Zacchaeus stood up and he said, "Look, Lord, here and now, I'll give half of what I own to those who are poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay it back. I will pay back 4 times the amount that I took." Did you hear that? Zacchaeus decided to give half his money to people in poverty, and he promised to pay back what he'd stolen from the people. In fact, if he had stolen $100, he said he would give them back $400. Wow! Can you imagine how you would feel if someone had taken something of yours and they gave back 400 things? Amazing, right? Because of Jesus' love and forgiveness, Zacchaeus was a completely changed person. He chose to make things right with the people he'd treated badly. And can you guess what Jesus did next? What was it we were learning about today? Anybody remember? Oh, well, if you guessed that Jesus decided to forgive Zacchaeus, you are right. Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to your house. You are a member of Abraham's family line. The Son of Man came to look for the lost and save them." Jesus is talking about himself. He's the one who's come to look for the lost, people like Zacchaeus, and save them and bring them back into the family of their people. Now, we know that when you forgive others, it can change them. Can you imagine how Zacchaeus' life was forever changed because of Jesus? I mean, if someone stole $100 from you and then they paid you back $400, would you maybe think about giving them a second chance? Zacchaeus was no longer an outcast. Jesus had shown him love, even though he had done things wrong in the past. And Zacchaeus had such a huge change of heart from being forgiven that he changed his whole life. And you know what? Forgiveness can do the same for us. So this week, I challenge you to notice how it feels to forgive someone and how it feels to be forgiven. Even if your name isn't Zacchaeus and you're not hanging out in a tree, I have a feeling that forgiveness might change things in your life too.